Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Making the Most of Meetings. My name is Talia Hoffman. I am the training coordinator here at CWD and I'll be administering today's webinar. Please feel free at any time to enter questions in the chat box and we will address them as we go or potentially at the end depending on what works best. Also, please be sure if you haven't to answer our poll to receive credit for attending. And I'm going to let Sarah take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Making the Most of Meetings. My name is Sarah Staley. I'm an organizational development consultant here at the Center for Workplace Development. And I know we collectively spend a lot of time in meetings, and we're here today to try to figure out best practices to make them more effective and a more productive use of everyone's time. So depending on whether you're usually a participant or usually a facilitator or both, hopefully you'll get a lot out of this. I like to say that facilitators have to do the job of an effective participant too. So as a participant, you can help a facilitator. As a facilitator, you can be an effective participant. So pay attention to all sides of this, and hopefully we'll have some good content and a little bit of chat box discussion as well. And I look forward to answering your questions. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our objectives for today are to really cover some of the basics of meetings best practices, what to do before, during, and after to make sure that the meeting is successful. Also, we're going to talk about PPC, which if you take one thing away from this webinar, that's what I hope you'll take away. The importance of having your purpose, your process, and your content figured out and appropriate to the meeting before the meeting. And lastly, we'll spend some time on strategies for dealing with difficult meeting behaviors. So if this was easy, you probably all wouldn't be here. So we're going to work on how to kind of make the most effective meetings, even when some meeting participants may not be participating the way you'd like them to. So those are our objectives. We'll go on to our agenda. Lots to cover in the hour, but I think we can do it. Also, you should have received an email from me before the webinar this morning with a participant guide. Hopefully you have that open. If not, just follow along and we can make sure you get that later. But if you do have it, please look on page 1. You'll see the agenda there as well as some additional things we'll be covering. And our agenda is to really quickly talk about why this is important, what makes meetings effective and ineffective, cover the PPC, purpose, process, and content, the before, during, and after, and then talk about what the role of a participant is and what the role of a facilitator is before we get into challenges, action planning, resources, and we can take questions as we go as well as at the end, as Talia said. So to get us started, if you could use the chat box, hopefully everyone can see that on the right side of their screen, to start to just populate it with some things that you think make meetings ineffective. We'll let you take a moment, see some chat hopefully popping up, just start brainstorming collectively in that chat box, anything that you know that makes meetings ineffective for you. And we've got some things coming in, so I'm going to let Talia talk to us about what she's seeing.
All right, what makes meetings ineffective? Looks like we have some good answers. I think we've all experienced one person dominating the conversation, taking control of the meeting, off-topic chit-chat that might be really fun but might take us over time. Let's see what else. Oh, lack of participation from attendees can be just as difficult as having one person dominate. Participants or facilitators being ill-prepared can definitely send us over time. Talking over each other, tangents, too many meetings. We definitely see that pop up for a lot of people. Let's see what else. A lot of similar things, lack of structure, chit-chat, no clear goals. That is definitely very important for a meeting. Let's see.
I'm seeing no agenda popping up several times, so that's usually kind of the baseline, is to make sure you have that agenda because it's such a tool as we talk about some of these challenges. If you don't have an agenda to pull people back to, you're kind of already at a lack. So the preparation that people are bringing up as well being so important.
Yeah, it seems like the general themes are not being prepared, off-topic chat, people dominating or not participating. people just not being interested in the meeting. And one I did just see pop up, which I think is great, is lack of action items at the end of meetings and a plan for how you're going to take this forward.
Absolutely. So great list. I think a lot of that is covered both in terms of best practices as well as some of the challenges we'll talk about later in the webinar. So as you might have expected, the corollary is coming up here. What makes meetings effective? So if you could also do some quick thinking there, we'll swipe the board on the ineffective ones and take a look at some of the things that make meetings effective. So if you could start to put some things in there on that. Thank you.
We're seeing definitely some of the opposites: a good facilitator, good agenda, good preparation, it's on time, clearly defined goals, definitely ties with having a well-prepared facilitator and agenda. Let's see. Time constraints on topic conversations within the meeting. I can definitely see where that would be important. Participants are engaged, they're not disengaged. Let's see. Oh, designated roles during the meeting. Seems like it would be a very good idea. Decisions are made at the end, meetings are kept short, on time, and you see action items coming out at the end. Keep them coming, but I think we've definitely got, that covers a lot of good bases. Oh, use of technology for visualization. That's very interesting as well.
Absolutely, and being prepared and having a backup plan for your technology is sometimes a good idea as well. But yeah, making things visual that can help people be engaged. So as you're seeing and hearing and sharing, there's a lot of different things to keep track of. If you are somebody who does facilitate meetings, I think you have to kind of recognize that you are responsible for the effectiveness of the meeting. In the end, the buck stops with the facilitator. So having a good one, a prepared one that's thinking ahead and really focused on moderating the discussion is really crucial. But again, as participants, you can help the facilitator and you can bring your own self into it. We'll talk about both sides now. So thank you for your contributions. So as I said, my kind of primary takeaway for you today is the importance of purpose, process, and content, PPC. So if anything, whether or not the meeting has all of the components, all the best practices, you absolutely need to know what the purpose is at the outset, both when planning the meeting, attending the meeting, or putting together the agenda and actually running the meeting. The action items at the end, that's usually one of the purposes, so if you miss that, then you might not have fulfilled your purpose. So if you are a participant in the meeting and it's unclear to you on what the purpose is, before you show up at that meeting, reach out to the facilitator, ask them what the purpose is, and help them to really do some thinking about that. Process, again, that's where the agenda kind of really showcases what process you're going to follow. We'll talk a bit about different purposes and processes for meetings, depending on what you're trying to cover, and that's the last piece, is what content are you trying to address. So these answers should be really clear to everybody before the meeting begins. So when do you hold a meeting? There's some basic purposes that make sense. Information sharing I have up there, that's the cautionary tale. So as you saw in the, or as we talked out in the chat, some people said ineffective meetings are ones that just happen too frequently, or there's too many. Sometimes we have a lot of information sharing meetings, so before you have an information sharing meeting, just think about, is this the best use of everybody's collective time? Sometimes that information can be shared previous to the meeting so that the meeting can be shortened. Sometimes it doesn't need to be shared in a meeting, it can be shared in another format. But certainly confidential information or information that everybody needs to hear and be able to react to together, there's lots of times you do want to have an information sharing meeting. But many of our meetings are either brainstorming meetings or decision-making meetings, sometimes both, and it's really important to be clear, going back to that purpose. If it's a brainstorming meeting, we're trying to generate ideas, we're not trying to critique ideas, we're trying to really leverage the collective brain power of the people in the room. If it's a decision-making meeting, you're really trying to come to a decision at the end of the meeting, and it's important to be clear on what types of decisions are being made. So we'll talk about that in a little while. Okay, so now we're going to do just a little more best practice sharing. The first part is what do we need to do before a meeting. Again, I imagine we now have, I think we had 47 people signed up for this, so the collective experience that we have on this webinar with hours in meetings, I can't even fathom. So if people could start putting in the chat box anything that you think you need to do before the meeting begins to make that effective meeting. We'll share some of those out.
Prepare the agenda. That would be good. Just having an agenda might be good. Oh, calendaring, make sure it gets in there. Any materials, supplemental materials that need to be ready. You make sure you know what you're talking about, who needs to be attending. If you need any specific thoughts from the participants ahead of time, make sure you communicate that to them so they can have their answers ready. Yeah, it seems a lot about participant preparation and making sure there's an agenda and everyone knows what's expected of them at the meeting.
Perfect.
What else? Oh, making sure people have materials to write with.
That's
Simple
good.
thing, or a phone or something.
Especially as a participant, being prepared as you enter the meeting.
Oh, also in asking participants if they have any agenda items, depending on the type of meeting, especially if it's brainstorming. Let's see. Oh, and make sure people show up on time.
Absolutely.
I like that one. Sounds like a pretty good list.
Great list. We'll share ours now. I think you covered it all. So, again, make sure you have the purpose. Make sure there is an agenda. We recommend that the agenda, and this came up earlier in terms of effective meetings, have topics, have timing associated with those topics, and have owners for each of those topics, because sometimes the facilitator will be running the whole meeting, but sometimes there's shared ownership, and particularly if you are asking people to submit items, likely it's important to know what the expectation is on their leading that part of the meeting. Inviting people, definitely calendar is a good way to do it because you get that kind of instant, you know who's coming, you know who's not coming. If somebody is not coming, maybe circling back, making sure they know what is expected of them to get up to speed, and assigning any roles that people will be playing during the meeting. We'll talk more about roles later. Sharing information, directions, distributing that agenda, the prep materials so people can come prepared. A good rule of thumb is to do it 24 hours in advance so people have that time. That's something that is helpful sometimes for departments or people who meet collectively regularly to talk about what is kind of the expectation for when an agenda will come out. If people are submitting items, what kind of time do they need to get those together, et cetera. And then taking care of those meeting logistics. Do you have the room, the tech, the food sometimes is good, not always available, but do people have the materials, the writing utensils, all the things that people need to have to be able to really fully participate in that meeting. And I will share out these slides afterwards, so feel free to take notes, but you can also know those will show up after this webinar. So, meeting has started or is about to begin. What should we do during the meeting? Please enter your responses in the chat box. What's important to take care of during a meeting to make it effective?
Participate. That's a great first one. Making sure you take notes specifically around action items. I like that. There's like notes with a purpose. Review the agenda at the beginning, a great way to sort of set the stage. Make sure you participate. Don't conduct side conversations. Keep it within the group. I like that a lot. You're saying taking notes, participating. Be a good listener. That's a very good one. Sometimes it can be hard to stop your brain, really listen to what's going on. Encouraging participation, silencing your phone. That's a very good one. Don't pay attention, sticking to the agenda, and keeping the conversation on point. Yeah, it seems to be general things about avoiding distractions, being an active participant, listening, making sure you're personally ready for the meeting, and making sure you keep everything on time. All right, great responses, everyone.
Fantastic, as usual, covering most of what we had in mind here. So this came up before, start your meeting on time, end your meeting on time, or if you can, early. I think sometimes we fill the extra time, but if the agenda items have been covered, end the meeting. Also consider we have a default kind of hour meeting at Harvard. Sometimes meetings don't need to be an hour, they could be a half hour or even shorter. The 15-minute stand-up meeting, I've seen that practiced well around Harvard as well. Setting meeting ground rules, so this gets to kind of the distractions, the turning off your phone. Those are the very kind of basic ground rules if you want people not to be distracted or you want them to participate fully in the meeting or not answer their phone, to really state that as part of the ground rules. If you've been to CWD classes before, you know we set our ground rules at the beginning of each meeting or each class. Our V's, so we have the Vegas rule, which is a confidentiality rule. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. We have our value rule to look for the value in participating in the class. We have the Veritas rule, which is truth, to bring your truth into the class. We also have the vibrate rule, which is to silence your phone, and the voice rule, which is to fully participate. So if you like those rules, you can use those in your meetings. But it's important, particularly for meetings that will happen over time, to set those ground rules up front, particularly when we get into talking about challenges. If you haven't set ground rules or norms for your meetings, it's harder to hold people accountable to them. So a lot of what I see in that kind of poor behavior has a lot to do with setting up those ground rules to begin with. Before your meeting, when it starts, reviewing the agenda, the purpose, the roles. So as I said, assigning roles can be helpful. Knowing who the facilitator is a key role. Having a scribe or note taker is often a key role. And another one that I think can be very effective is a timekeeper. So somebody who's helping the facilitator to stay on time as an objective observer, saying, we're 5 minutes in, or this agenda item has 5 more minutes, that type of thing, just keeping time. So those are some roles you might want to use. Obviously, managing the meeting, we'll talk more about the facilitator's role in that and the participants' role in that, but keeping people to that agenda, easier said than done. We'll get into that later. And then agreeing at the end on action items, on key decisions, on responsibility, summarizing those things, making sure they're in the notes so that when the notes go out, people really know that the purpose of the meeting was met, and perhaps prepping for that next meeting. Okay, and finally, enter your responses, if you would, in the chat box on what you should do after a meeting.
Oh, send out notes to the participants, following up on action items. We're going over maybe emailing out next steps. I can see a lot of things about establishing who's going to do what. Let's see. Oh, asking any questions if you didn't understand something in the meeting, making sure you get clarification. The scribe could send out the notes with the action items and the assignments. That could be a good central way. And if you're a participant, be sure you complete your action items. These are all great. Let's see if anything else comes through we haven't seen yet. Oh, you know, if you get some sort of assignment from the meeting, making sure you keep track of it in your Outlook or something and you don't lose it. Yeah, thanks everyone. These are really good responses. Oh, set up a follow-up meeting if needed. There we go.
Fabulous. And I saw review your notes. So again, as a participant, taking responsibility for your pieces. So I didn't have much to add here. Distribute those notes, follow up, follow through. Another thing to think about in terms of a meeting that maybe didn't go as well is what might you want to do to follow up on, like one-on-one with somebody, or sometimes things get tabled. A good practice is to have a parking lot. So if there are some of those topics coming up that you don't have time to discuss, you're capturing those somewhere. So sometimes after a meeting, you might want to review the parking lot, figure out how you're going to attend to items, if there's a kind of offline meeting that needs to happen for the next meeting. All that stuff can make your next meeting more productive and ensure that this meeting was also a good use of everybody's time. Okay, so we've covered kind of all of our basics, best practices. We're going to get a little bit into 2.0 now, what to think about in terms of the meeting. I'm also going to have you start to look through your participant guide. So just to let you know, on page 2, there's a meeting planner's checklist. So all those before the meeting items, if this is a helpful tool for you, you can use this every time you have a meeting. Have I covered all my bases? On page 3, you have some sample ground rules, so you can use our V rules, or if you like these, you can use these. You can modify them. 2 different ways to present ground rules. Sometimes people present them and then ask, is everybody in agreement with these? Is there anything you'd like to add? Another way is to actually collectively come up with the ground rules together, depending on if that's worth the time, if you need more collective buy-in, if it's kind of a trickier type of meeting. So Three types of ways to do brainstorming. If you're having a brainstorming meeting, I'm on page 4 in your participant guide. Most of the time what we think about is unstructured brainstorming. Everybody's kind of adding in their ideas, capturing them in one place, kind of speaking out ideas as they come to us. That's a great way to brainstorm and a great use of a meeting. Some of us respond better to that than others. Again, another way to prep your people is to help them to think about these things beforehand. So if you tend to be more introverted or maybe not as more likely to need more time to reflect and come up with ideas, having some prep questions can be helpful. But also for folks who might want to do more individual reflection before they share out, structured brainstorming can be a good way to do that. So that's just a kind of round robin where each person is going to know they have a turn to share. You go around the table. If you don't have an idea to share, you just say pass, and you go around until everybody feels like they've shared their ideas. It can just create a little more structure, and also some of those challenges we're going to talk about if people aren't participating or they don't have a voice or one person tends to dominate, putting some structure around that brainstorming can be helpful. And then there's silent brainstorming. If you've been to a CWB class, we do a lot of this. You write your idea on a Post-it, you stick it up. Nobody needs to know who came up with what, but it's a real quick, efficient, and kind of anonymous, more safe way sometimes for people to share ideas. So that's silent brainstorming. Again, if you're having a brainstorming meeting, just to remember the idea is to get quantity over quality. It's not about criticism. Oftentimes as a facilitator, you might need to step back if somebody starts critiquing an idea to say, remember, this is a brainstorming meeting. We're really just trying to generate ideas, and the more the better. Outrageous ideas are welcome. Adding on to other people's ideas, really letting things blossom. You never know where kind of the best nut of brainstorming is going to come from. So if you have any questions about anything we've covered so far, or questions about brainstorming in particular, feel free to start adding those into the chat box. So the other kind of type of meeting is the decision-making meeting, and it's really important in this type of meeting to think in advance about how this decision is going to be made. Particularly if you're a leader making decisions, oftentimes people can assume at Harvard that decisions are made on consensus basis, and I think that's frequently the case. I think that if you want buy-in on things, going for consensus is definitely a good way to go, but sometimes there are issues that require a either faster approach or may require a decision to be made by an executive, depending on whether maybe it's a compliance thing or maybe it's a risk thing, or maybe it's just really important to the strategic direction of the organization. So in cases where it's going to be a leader's call or an executive decision, it's really important that the leader says that up front, that I want your input, I want to hear from you, and in the end, this decision I will make. And then if it's going to be majority rule, so that's kind of in between consensus and executive, it's going to be a little bit faster. You might get a little bit more buy-in, but in the end, you'll vote and kind of say whatever the top vote is, gets it. So we're all familiar with these. The important thing is to really make sure in a decision-making meeting, everybody knows which type of decision is being made. Again, if you have questions about decision-making meetings, feel free to put those in the chat box. On page 7 of your participant guide, you have a procedure for making decisions. So if you are going into a decision-making meeting, you can use this process as a way to kind of form your agenda and make sure that you kind of come up with a lot of ideas and criteria for deciding between those ideas, compare those options, and get to a good decision. Because making a collective decision, as we all know, can be a difficult thing in a meeting. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a moment for some self-reflection. You should be on page 8 of your participant guide. So as you can, if you don't have your participant guide, I'll read through some of these prompts and you can just think about them. But otherwise, take some time now to reflect on page 8 on your own participation during meetings. So all of these are behaviors that are good, active participation behaviors and really just do a little self-assessment on how often am I being a good participant. Usually the answer is it depends on the meeting. Sometimes it depends on the day, but these are some of the behaviors that we'd like you to reflect on. Do you ask open-ended questions? Do you paraphrase what you heard? Do you let colleagues express their thoughts without interruption? Have you acknowledged and responded to emotions in a meeting? Have you sought the ideas of others? Have you used your colleagues' talents and experiences for the benefit of discussion and decision-making? Have you learned from group members and from the team's experience? Have you helped move the conversation along? Have you confirmed commitment to completing any action items as needed? Were you clear about how decisions would be made? Were you aware of the time allocated for topics and the overall meeting? Were you aware of your body language and its impact on the meeting, as well as your tone of voice and words? And were you energetic and positive? I've heard people kind of question that last one. Be your authentic self, so you don't need to come to a meeting with a persona, but I think it gets to this, is everybody engaged and participating? So just another minute, in case I'm distracting you with my voice, to think about this, self-reflect, and do your assessment. Okay, so hopefully you had some time for self-assessment and reflection. Feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat box, but really that's just for you to think about your own meeting participation. So as I said, a facilitator needs to be a good participant, and a participant can really help the facilitator because, as you see from this list, which is also on page 9 of your participant guide, the facilitator has to do a lot. They have to actively listen, be kind of aware of the behaviors in the group, as well as moving the meeting along. So this comes from the International Association of Facilitators, and these are best practices for a facilitator. So that said, I think we're ready to move into some of the challenging meetings and how you can either facilitate bad behavior in a meeting or at least challenging meeting dynamics as either a facilitator or a participant.
So I'm going to pause us for 1 second.
Sure.
We had 2 questions come in, one which I think will be related to what you're going to discuss next. But someone was a little bit curious if you could say more about responding to emotions as well as body language in a meeting, probably from the participant and the facilitator perspective.
Absolutely, great question. And you want to do that carefully, so I think I'm glad somebody brought this up. So oftentimes when you come up with a common meeting challenge, or kind of see that either people being quiet or one person being extra vocal, or perhaps people talking over each other or interrupting, there's emotion involved there. And sometimes, particularly as a facilitator, it's worth kind of mirroring back to the group. So, you know, I see that people have changed their body language, and I'm wondering if something was said that wasn't helpful. Or this seems like a topic that people have a lot of passion around. We're hearing that and seeing that in the room. Do people need to take a break? It doesn't have to be. You certainly don't want to kind of put people on the spot or make assumptions about the emotions people are feeling. So it's really just observing what you see that might be coming across in people's body language, tone of voice, or the way they're participating. And you can do that as a helpful participant as well, to say, you know, I can see that we might need more time on this because people haven't been able to really fully state their opinions, or whatever you need to do. So those are kind of some ways to reflect on emotions, and then also remembering sometimes that meeting in the moment, it's not the right time to respond to the emotions, and you might need to have an offline meeting, talk with somebody one-on-one if something got really emotional during that meeting. So great question. Thank you for bringing that up. Feel free to ask a follow-up question if you have more on that. Other questions, Talia?
So I think one would actually be one of the common meeting challenges potentially is what may happen if someone in the meeting is acting disrespectfully towards the facilitator or person who is leading the meeting.
Okay, that's a great one. So we will kind of cover the common meeting challenges and then maybe come back to that because I think there'll be some similarities in approach there. But so on that note, in addition to disrespectful behavior towards a facilitator or perhaps towards another participant, what other common meeting challenges, we heard some of these in the ineffective meetings, do people come up against, particularly ones you'd like us to talk about here and now? Start to enter those, if you would, into the chat box.
All right, so we have some good meeting challenges coming in. We have differences in involvement. That can be really tough if you have different levels of involvement by the participants. Maybe a subject falls flat. Maybe you put a subject out there and nobody really wants to participate or talk about it. People aren't listening. I see crickets coming in. A challenge we've seen come through before, keeping on topic, keeping the meeting going. Let's see, having very opinionated participants, someone dominating. We've definitely seen that theme before. And it can be hard in a meeting if someone who's more senior level is disengaged from the meeting. That can be hard for those who are also in the meeting with them. I can definitely see that. People, again, we're seeing maybe being a little disrespectful, participants or the facilitator, going in multiple directions. Being able to control the time. Yeah. Seems like those are coming through. You know, side conversations, people not participating, or people participating in a disrespectful way. Those seem to be some big themes.
I saw people who see their veritas as veritas. I like that. So bringing your own truth is naming that this is what is true for me and not the collective truth. So a lot of what meetings are about is to really provide a space where you can see a bigger picture on an issue. You can see different perspectives. You can see what we like to call going to the balcony, kind of what would be the big picture view, not only from my own seat, but from the collective vantage point. So certainly that's an issue that might be a thread throughout several of these. So I think I will come back to some of the ones that are not on our list and invite you to add again later, but these are some of the ones that we'll just kind of talk about quickly that I definitely heard you all come up with. So running out of time, that's a kind of consistent one, whether it's because of tangents or people chit-chatting or all the other reasons we've heard already. One participant dominating the discussion, and then there were some variations on that, whether it has to do with who that person is or what the tone of their contributions are. How to table a discussion, if the meeting's going off track or it's not productive, what you might do. A group that is repeating points kind of over and over, the little or no group participation. So there's your crickets, or if the group falls silent or just doesn't contribute, or if a certain person isn't contributing. And then we'll talk a little bit about conflict that arises. So feel free to add in your own advice here. Again, we've all been in these situations, so what have you seen done that is effective? The first one for moving the meeting along or running out of time, so as you're putting your own thoughts in. Again, a lot of these go back to setting ground rules, so if you have a kind of agreed upon method, having a timekeeper or deciding that there's a symbol or a signal of some sort when your time is up, that can be very helpful. If it's the facilitator's role, then to just say, okay, I see we have a few minutes left for this meeting, these topics, are we ready to move along? So a lot of it's just checking in as you are running out of time or time is not being used the way you expected, just to stop and not let that happen, but say, okay, we are changing our approach to time here. What do we want to do about this collectively? Getting the group's permission to go over the allocated time if that's what seems to be warranted. Again, a lot of this is about that objective timekeeper and the parking lot idea that I mentioned before. So sometimes it's effective to say, okay, this seems to be a separate meeting. Maybe we can have another meeting with a subset of this group to talk about some of these things and postpone some of the discussions that aren't pertinent to the meeting to another time. I see have estimated times on the agenda. That's a crucial one. It's very hard to keep a meeting on track time-wise if you don't have that sense ahead of time. A participant is dominating the discussion. So again, feel free to add your own comments, your own thoughts, how you've seen this dealt with effectively. I think we've all seen somebody kind of thank them for their contribution and ask if anyone else has ideas to share. That seems to be a pretty common one. There's the kind of more chronic behavior where you might need to speak to that person in private about their behavior or after the meeting and say, I'd really like to make sure that this is more of a collective voice. I think sometimes body language can help whether you're the facilitator or participant. People sometimes need to be cued into the fact that they're dominating the discussion, so whether it's actually stating, like I said, this mirroring idea, saying it seems like we've only heard a few voices or some voices are getting more time than others. That's a more direct way of mirroring. Another way is if you're the facilitator and you're standing up, you can walk away from that person. You can kind of direct your attention somewhere else. If you're a participant, same thing, eye contact. Again, we all know about active listening and helping a speaker, giving them eye contact, nodding your head, giving them kind of both verbal and nonverbal cues to keep going. We can do the same thing. We need to kind of change our body language and give them verbal and nonverbal cues that maybe it's time to kind of stop. So anything else people want to add, feel free, but those are a number of approaches. Tabling the discussion. So again, if something needs to kind of just move on, saying it sounds like further research needs to be done or we don't have time, but again, getting the group's kind of collective agreement to that and setting another time where you'll get to that discussion. Okay, if the meeting is going off track or it isn't productive. So sometimes that's because there's an unclear purpose, so just referring back to the purpose of this meeting was to can be a helpful way to get people back on track. When you're putting together your agenda, having outcomes in mind, so if it's a decision-making meeting, we need to have this decision made, kind of pulling people back to what are we trying to accomplish, what's the deliverable coming out of this meeting. Again, sometimes the agenda items, we take on too many in a meeting. I like the rule of 3. If you have an agenda with 20 different items, you're probably going to get off track. So kind of saying, did you pick the right agenda items? Did they fit the purpose? Was the process and content the right choice? And then again, sometimes just recognizing when you see the crickets in the room or you see that people aren't participating, sometimes that's an emotional thing, sometimes that's an issue thing, and sometimes it's just that doesn't apply to that person. So did you pick the right people to come to the meeting? Are the people who are there the right people to have in the room? and perhaps an item that doesn't require everybody can be left till the end so that people can leave. There's different ways of structuring your meeting to kind of prevent and deal with these things as they come up. Again, feel free to add your own pointers there. The group keeps repeating the points made, so sometimes this could be a conflict thing where you have different perspectives in the room and people kind of don't feel like they're being heard, or it could be that, you know, there is agreement in the room and nobody has just really just said, okay, I think we're in agreement, let's move forward. So if this is happening, referring back to the agenda again, if you don't have that agenda, it makes it very difficult to manage your meeting, to say that you have a certain amount of time for this. But also, somebody before brought up tech and visualization. Somebody asked a question about PowerPoint. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. But if you can put people's ideas on paper or on a flip chart where they can see, okay, this has been heard, it's been recognized, it's part of the record. The person taking notes perhaps could read back everything that has been said. Summarizing, paraphrasing, again, oftentimes this is just everybody needs to know that their point has been heard and we're ready to move on. And then the crickets one, when the group falls silent or doesn't participate. So sometimes as a facilitator, that's a good thing. People are thinking, they're reflecting. Sometimes you, before you jump in or ask a question, need to give people that time. Giving people permission to think, you might say, okay, let's just take a few minutes to think this over before we move on. And then the ground rules piece, like we said, the voice rule means we'd like people to participate, so establishing those rules up front. And then again, people like to participate in different ways. So perhaps you might say, turn to a partner and, you know, share a couple of ideas, or let's break into smaller groups so people can think about, or maybe you've asked a really broad question or too general question, people don't know how to respond. You might try rephrasing your question or breaking it down so that people can really think and respond to one piece at a time. So those are all some thoughts. So please continue to add your own ideas. We'll talk about conflict a little bit, and then we can kind of dig in some of the questions that have already come up, some of the other challenges that came up. So conflict really demonstrates the importance of having ground rules and norms. So if you have a ground rule like value that I mentioned before, which is kind of appreciating the contribution of everybody in the room, sometimes if somebody, we heard before a question about disrespect, if somebody's being disrespectful, sometimes pointing back to the value norm, saying we really value everybody's opinion here. It can be the fact that people have norms that are sort of, we want this to be a place where we have devil's advocates or we hear diverse opinions. The Veritas rule, same thing. It's kind of saying we want to hear your own truth. It may not be my truth. I may not agree with you, but this is a place where we are trying to kind of allow people to agree and disagree in a safe way. Focusing on the substance of the idea and not the personal style. So oftentimes when people get into conflict, they're taking something personal that's really more of a difference of opinion. So really separating the person from the problem, that person's an ally in solving the problem. It's not Talia, who I'm here with today. It's not Talia being difficult, it's Talia having a different opinion. And so if I can kind of separate out those two things, that's important. Again, if it's not productive, sometimes you might need to mirror that or share that out, saying, let's keep our comments, you know, focused on the issue here. And sometimes if somebody says something that is, you know, argumentative, that's a really important point. So kind of to ask a more helpful learning question. So can you tell us what we're not thinking of that you have in mind, or it sounds like you have a different idea. Can you give us some other options? Those are some ways to kind of probe into something that feels like conflict but may actually be very productive for the meeting. So if there's anything in the challenges that we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about, please do start to add those into the chat. I'll cover some of the questions that we've already received. So on the topic of PowerPoint, I do think it depends. Part of the issue with meetings is how big they are sometimes. So in most cases, a more effective meeting will have, less people around the table. To get the full kind of diversity of opinion, you need to have a number of people, but the more people you add, the less likely it is that everybody will have a chance to participate. People might misunderstand, mishear. So if you have a very large group, I think that might be a good time to use a PowerPoint to sometimes provide structure. I think the issue with PowerPoint is more how you use it than if you use it. So don't kind of put everything you want to say in your PowerPoint. It's better to kind of have some guiding points and talk to them. A PowerPoint can be really effective for keeping an agenda on track, so it can kind of focus as a visual agenda. And I think just asking meeting participants, what would be helpful? Is it helpful if we use PowerPoint? How would you like to use PowerPoint, particularly if it's a meeting that you're going to be having over and over again? I see a question about the slides. I will provide the slides after this so everybody can have their own personal copy, and I'm glad that you have found them to be helpful. Something about body language was mentioned earlier, so just effective meeting body language. Again, you can be your authentic self, but coming into the meeting, really staying focused. Your body can help to demonstrate that you're doing that by establishing eye contact, sitting up straight, sometimes standing up if you're the facilitator, or maybe even having a meeting where there is some physical movement. Some people might want to kind of move around and look at a gallery walk is something we do sometimes to look at different opinions. That's just sticking ideas up on the wall and letting people kind of move through and look at them. So really just making sure that you're showing that you're alert and focused in the way that you're sitting, in the way that you're looking around, in the way that you're contributing, all those pieces. So if there was something else, that question that I'm missing, let me know. But you don't want your body to be saying something different than what you're actually saying. So that's where people get confused. We call that noise. If I'm saying, I think that's a great idea, and my body language or my tone is saying something different, you're going to read my body language and my tone. So make sure that you're matching that with what you're saying. Okay. How are we doing on time? We have about 10 minutes. One other thing I saw in an earlier question is just about senior level. So I think that does complicate this. If you're the person facilitating the meeting and there's people of a higher level in there than you, or if your manager's in there, or whether it's the higher level person facilitating the meeting. So just kind of understanding, we all know that there are organizational politics. Part of that whole setting norms and ground rules up front is to kind of make it an option that somebody who is in the meeting who might not be at the high level to be able to participate in the right way. So it might be you want to actually have in your ground rules equality of voices in this room, or again, if the senior level person is the person who's distracting from the meeting, what behaviors do you need to see from participants to make that a more productive thing so that when that happens, everybody kind of can talk about it because it's been agreed upon. So definitely a tricky thing. Disrespect, those types of things, you probably are going to need to handle offline as well, because you certainly don't want to call out a senior leader in a meeting and call them out on their behavior and put the whole meeting at risk. So just thinking carefully. That's one I can talk briefly about on a webinar, but I would certainly encourage power, influence, and negotiation, or difficult conversations as a follow-up class to really dive into some of those deeper issues.
So we did have a question come in from the participant's perspective. Let's say you have a standing biweekly meeting. You are not the facilitator, you are a participant, and you're really looking to try and help change the culture of these meetings. How can you do that from that place of power, I suppose?
So if you are a participant, the standing meeting has been less effective, and you want to be able to kind of change the way the meetings run. So certainly, if a meeting's been in place a long time or something has been happening kind of the same way over time, it's harder to change. So that's why some of this is setting up a meeting well. But given you are here and you are asking this question, I always like to use these as permission points. So you can kind of just say, hey, I took this webinar on making the most of meetings, and I got some ideas, and I wonder if we might be open to changing our approach a little bit, that type of thing. So whether you want to use this as your kind of inroad or everybody wants to have a more effective meeting. So I think if you're prepared to kind of come up with some good ideas and see them through, again, not saying, here's why this meeting isn't effective and here's what, you're doing wrong, that is not going to be heard as well. But if you can say, I have some ideas of what I think might bring more energy to this meeting or make it more productive, hopefully that's an angle that people will be willing to listen to.
So we also had a question come in from the manager's perspective. Maybe they'll be having regular meetings with their staff, and they're sort of wondering, they want to use these meetings as a way to get to sort of know their staff, have their staff come to know each other, but they also want them to be productive. Is it productive to have everyone go around and share stories about themselves or sort of, what they did over the weekend? Is that productive, and how would you structure that kind of a meeting?
That's a great question, and I think a lot of it is personal styles and culture. So a lot of this does get to what type of group is this, how much time do you have, how regularly do they meet. Certainly I think as a manager of a team, there's a lot of value in doing some team building, sharing things with each other. I think it runs the gamut from, actually I know one team that I participate on does begin their meetings with everybody going around and kind of sharing something that's going on for them personally or what happened over the weekend, that type of thing. It can take some time, so that meeting is a longer meeting and a meeting that happens somewhat regularly, and if there's not time for that, I think people are open to it. That would not work in some other groups that I'm in, so I think striking the right balance. You might want to do some of those things in more of a retreat type setting that's less regular, and I think just getting to know people, maybe even having a conversation about, what do you like to get out of meetings? Do you prefer to start with something personal? These are some of the work style conversations. If you've ever taken any kind of work style assessments, that usually gives you some information on how you like to participate. If the majority of the group prefers to have a more personal style and share some more personal things, I think it's okay. If the majority group would not do that, then you might make people less comfortable and get in the way of your kind of whole purpose in doing so. So I think maybe some one-on-one meetings with your people to get a sense of how they'd like the meetings to be is a good way to set yourself up for success there.
So sort of a follow-up question, looking at maybe you're the leader manager of these regular meetings. How do you get people to be more involved? I know we discussed some of this, but maybe there's some other tips you have up your sleeve.
So getting more involved during the meeting, I think the tip before about having people submit ideas in advance, things they'd like to talk about, giving them roles during the meeting or giving them ownership. After this webinar, I'm happy to send some places where I get ideas for how to kind of make a meeting different, how to make it a little more interactive. So you might use some way of, sometimes we put markers on the table and let people draw. That may not fit well with your culture, but again, it just shakes things up, gets people to participate in a different way. So being creative about how to use a meeting doesn't need to just be we all sit down and talk together for an hour. There's a lot of different ways you can structure it so that there's different types of activities and different ways to contribute.
So one more question we had come through was about, we have a standing meeting every week about the same thing. How do I, as sort of a participant, broach that with the facilitator, or maybe it's my manager who's running the meeting? Is it something similar to bringing up this class that they came and took and attended? What do you think?
So I'm hearing this as kind of you're rehashing things, or you're kind of feeling it's repetitive. So I think maybe shortening that meeting, maybe making it a stand-up meeting. I don't know if that's something you would have control over. Otherwise, to really think about, okay, what is the purpose of this meeting? What do you need getting out of it? Kind of that deliverables, action items, et cetera, to kind of build that into the agenda or the structure so that at least everybody would kind of see, okay, last week we covered X. That's a nice way to do it too, to kind of, before you start the meeting, say, here's what we did last time, and bring those threads in. This time we really want to accomplish Y. Let's really focus on that. So those would be my ideas. I'm happy to talk offline if you want to respond to my email or pick up the phone. We could talk more about specifics. Before we run out of time, and I'm happy to stay on and continue to answer some questions, but you can see there's a slide up here about learning points and action plan. You have at the end of your participant guide on page 10 and 11 a little bit about the importance of meeting evaluation. This can be a really good way to deal with some of these issues too, to actually have a time at the end of the meeting where you say, what worked well about this meeting? What could we do to improve this meeting? I participated in a meeting outside of work where we did this at the beginning of the year, and I have to say, people named a few very concrete things that we fixed, and it's a more effective meeting. And just having that kind of placeholder in your agenda where you evaluate the meeting can allow you to not feel like you have to be put on the spot to make improvements on a meeing. We will be asking you to fill out an evaluation for this webinar. You'll receive that for Metrics That Matter, so please let us know what you think so that we can also evaluate how helpful this was to you. And on page 13 of your participant guide, you have a place to jot down some notes on things you learned, things you'd like to do differently, stop doing, continue doing. It's really helpful if you take the time to really think about what you want to do with what you learned today. So I'll take us to the last slide. On page 12 of your participant guide, you have resources for further learning. An hour is short and sweet, so online learning you can take advantage of, articles you can read, books. I like the Death by Meeting book, especially if you're maybe feeling like you're really in one particularly unproductive meeting. That can be a good place to go to kind of, especially, again, if you're in a manager role, how you might take that on. Going back to some of the questions we received. The Don't Just Do Something Stand There is a more of a facilitation book, so if you really want to dive into getting better as a facilitator, that's a great way to go. So I'll stay on for additional questions, and I'll let Talia kind of close us out officially.
Yes, so if anyone has not had a chance, please answer the poll with your full first and last name. That way we can give you credit for attending. We are recording this webinar, and we will be posting it on the Watch and Learn page on Harvey in case you missed something, you want to re-listen, or you want to share it with someone else in your office. Please feel free. We'll probably get that up by the end of the week.
Thank you all for your participation. Feel free to ask more questions or send email, pick up the phone if you want to talk further. A lot to cover in an hour, but I really enjoyed doing this with you today, and hopefully it was a productive use of your time.
All right, I don't think we're having any more questions come through. Thank you, everyone, for the thank yous. We're glad you found the session helpful, and hopefully we'll see you soon at CWD.
Thanks.